Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be covering these peer-reviewed articles, supposedly proving intelligent design. Unfortunately for this episode, we're only going to have time to cover the first, and there's a very good reason for that, and I'm going to be getting into that shortly. But first I need to issue a pseudo-correction for my last episode in this series. I said that a vestige was a useless adaptation, that it no longer served its original purpose, but that's not entirely accurate. A vestige also is a structure that no longer serves its purpose, but it can serve it in a diminished capacity. So if it's diminished in its capacity, it's still a vestige, and this still applies to both molecular and physical traits. Now with that out of the way, let's continue on. Now I've spoken about peer review before. It's where you submit your work to the scientific community and they check your math, check your work, and make sure that you got everything right. And if you didn't, they let you know so that you can correct it. Peer review is used to eliminate the one form of bias that the scientific method itself has a hard time dealing with, that of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is where you are so focused on what you're wanting that you begin to cloud your own findings. That's why there are things like double-blind studies, things of that nature. Anything you can do to eliminate confirmation bias in your work is great, but peer review is where confirmation bias effectively dies. Now, as I said, we're only going to have time to cover one article today. This one's from the Discovery Institute, and it is the only instance that I'm aware of that a creationist article has actually made it into a peer-reviewed journal. It's surprising how it got there. Well, not really surprising, but the story is quite a tale. The article in question was written by this man, Mr. Stephen Meyer. Now, he works directly for the Discovery Institute, and as I said, how his paper got in there is quite a story. If he looks familiar, it's because we covered him last time. He was in the video that I covered in the previous episode about irreducible complexity. He's going to be popping up quite a bit, him and Behe both. Now, the article in question appeared as the very last entry in the journal Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington. Now, it's very obscure, even in scientific circles, because it really only covers the discovery of new species. It will show you what they should look like based on where they were found in the strata and what the morphological characteristics are to be expected, but what they find is what they show you. They can do artist renderings, but they only show you what they know, which is the things that they've found. This paper is not realistically something that they would generally have covered. Now, this particular article appeared in volume 117, number 2, on pages 213 to 239 on August 4th of 2004. Now, you may be asking the same question I did. How did this happen? And we're going to get into that. This gentleman is Richard Sternberg. He was the editor at the time for the proceedings. Now, he had tendered his resignation about a year prior, and this was the second to last article that he was due to edit before he was done. He had issued his resignation, but he still had a commitment to edit the articles that were going to be coming out the next year. Now, Meyer contacted him about a manuscript he wanted published, this article in particular. Once Sternberg received a copy of the manuscript and evidence that he was a member of this particular society, he went through with the editing process and published it. Now, why is this strange? Well, first off, Sternberg handled the whole process, start to finish, which is very odd. He should have run it past a couple of other people. Also, he had really no business editing this article or reviewing it in the peer review process, because the Cambrian era, which Myers does talk about in this, is not Sternberg's area of expertise. His expertise is in systematics and taxonomy. Nothing to do with paleontology. He's not qualified to do any review on paleontological work. But it gets worse. Sternberg, of course, disputes that he had no business reviewing the article at all. He says that he ran it past 3 biologists and they all said it was good to go. But those biologists, to this day, remain unnamed. And he doesn't want to name them for fear of repercussions to them. In my opinion, personally, I don't think he ran it past anybody. Because any evolutionary biologist that looked at this that was legitimate would have shot it down. It had no business being published. Now, the article was pulled the following month with a statement from the proceedings saying that peer review processes in the future would be adhered to far more strictly. But the damage was done. Creationists in the Discovery Institute were throwing this article up in the air going, look, we've gotten something peer-reviewed. It's in a journal. You have no excuse now. Intelligent design is vindicated. Unfortunately, getting published in this journal is not the end of the process. It is the beginning of the process. Peer review runs constantly. Someone is going to look at this and have issues with it. And in fact, within 30 days of this being published, 3 people did have issue with it and issued a rebuttal on it. We'll be getting into that rebuttal here shortly, but suffice to say that the journal stated that publishing this article was a bad judgment call on Sternberg's part, and that there was incredible doubt as to whether or not any of the scientists that he spoke to were actually biologists, if he spoke to them at all. Now, this obviously sparked controversy, as things like this tend to do, with both sides railing against each other. Sternberg is on record as saying that since he was the chief editor of the journal in question, that he had full purview to choose whoever he wanted to review and edit the paper. And since he was, and I'm quoting, the most qualified individual to do so, he took it upon himself to shepherd this thing through the entire process to get it into the journal. As I already stated, Sternberg's areas of expertise is in systematics and taxonomy, not in paleontology, which is something that he should have noticed when Myers started talking about the Cambrian. Now, because this paper had touched on the Cambrian, he should have turned it over to one of the 3 people they had on staff at the time that were qualified in Cambrian paleontology to look at it and see if it was up to snuff. Obviously, that didn't happen because those 3 paleontologists were never consulted. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the paper that Myers submitted came as a result of a conversation that he had with Sternberg at a conference that they were both attending. Now, this in itself is not unusual. I'm sure these kinds of discussions happen all the time. Someone has an idea of something they want to get published in scientific journals, so they talk, they network, people get to know each other. They figure out where people are working and where the best opportunity for them to get their work published would come from. That's kind of what happened here, but the main issue is that there was a massive conflict of interest because the conference that these 2 gentlemen met at was in fact a creationist intelligent design conference, and an opponent of intelligent design for this very conference was barred from attending, so that raises a couple of flags right there. These 2 gentlemen share similar beliefs, so there's a conflict right there. Sternberg should have recused himself from even looking at this article, even touching it. He should have immediately slid it off to someone who was impartial, a third party, to look at it and evaluate it. But that's not the worst thing in this case. As I said, these 2 gentlemen share similar beliefs. It's not just the personal ties that they have, the interactions that they've had in the past. It's the organizations that they tend to represent. Myers, for example, works directly for the Discovery Institute. Sternberg is a member of the International Society for Complexity, Information, and Design. It is a creationist organization that is directly affiliated with the Discovery Institute. So now we have a conflict of interest on 2 fronts. He's also one of a few scientists who has signed a statement saying that he disagrees with evolution. Now, disagreeing with evolution on its own is not a problem. I really don't have an issue with that. It's generally a good idea to be skeptical of anything. but there's a difference between being skeptical and being unreasonable. You can be skeptical of evolution all you want, but once someone provides you sufficient evidence with what we know to be true, especially in today's day and age where we can show transition after transition, we can show genetically how species are related, we can show anything that creationists want to see. The difference is that your regular run-of-the-mill creationist, your average guy, is not well versed in scientific literature or terminology, and that's really not their fault. It kind of is, because they need to expand their own horizons and do their own research independently of what they're being told. But at the same time, people in high enough positions of authority and those with an actual scientific background, they know better. At that point, they're effectively lying. Advocating an intelligent design position means you're going to have to refute an awful lot of evidence in several fields of science in order to get your position to stand up to scrutiny. If you can't do that, then you don't have anything. And saying that a uber intelligent being orchestrated everything without any evidence of such a being existing or having existed at all is a problem. Now, not only do you need to provide evidence against evolution in this case, you need to provide evidence for intelligent design or creationism. They're one and the same, because one does not necessarily meet the criteria to be the other. You can disprove evolution, but then you've just got a hole that needs to be filled with knowledge, and suddenly saying, well, it's got to be an intelligent designer, if you don't have anything to back it up except an empty hole to shove something into, that's not going to cut it. Now that brings us to why Meyer's article is an error and should never have been published. Now, as I said, there were 3 scientists that took a look at this thing and had immediate issues with it. These 3 gentlemen wrote a critique of that particular article, and one of them was actually part of the Kitzmiller versus Dover case in opposition of intelligent design. So at that point, which this case took place a little bit later, but at that point he was very well versed in creationist tactics. Now, the first mistake itself is in the structure of the argument. It comes around to the same argument that we always hear. There's no evidence for evolution, or denying all the evidence for evolution, and stating that an intelligent designing agency would be a better explanation for what we observe in nature, without providing any evidence to support that. That's what this paper is all about. At no point in this paper does Meyer even hint at anything that would question evolution or support creation. So he's flawed on both fronts. He has nothing to back up his claims. He provides no model at all of how anything could have happened with an intelligent designer, why the intelligent designer would do something, or what the intelligent designer's method was, and or why it looks no different than blind chance. Without that kind of information, we can't form a hypothesis to test. And as I've covered before, if you can't form a hypothesis, then you don't have a single position that's worth looking at all. Most of the paper, in fact, is based on nothing more than an argument from incredulity and an argument from design, neither of which hold up to scrutiny. Now, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, Myers does talk about the Cambrian, which is where he really messed up. Because when you get a paleontologist that knows the Cambrian, this argument really falls apart. Now, one of the things that he was talking about in this paper is the Cambrian explosion. Now, creationists love using the Cambrian explosion as evidence that everything came into existence. Every phyla that we have came into existence all at once. That's not true. There are actually a couple of phyla in pre-Cambrian strata that were well extinct long before the Cambrian even started. So that entire argument is moot. Now, putting aside for the moment that radiometric dating puts the Cambrian era at several million years ago, and putting aside every dating method that we know that proves that, and putting aside for the moment that creationists generally will not accept anything older than 10,000 years as the age of the universe, there are other more serious issues to address. For one, Myers tries to count taxa. It was a method of morphological investigation that was ditched in favor of more accurate research methods for the Cambrian. I should note that most of Myers' citations in this particular section are his own, none of which appeared in any scientific journals, and all of which echo what he's saying here. No evidence to back it up at all. Now, next is, of course, a creationist staple that there are no transitional species, either going into the Cambrian, during the Cambrian, or exiting the Cambrian, all of which is demonstrably false. I've seen this argument from all three positions before, but in this case it seems that he was talking about inside the Cambrian. Now, that's, as I said, demonstrably false, and taking one creature and looking at it transitioning into another, it takes a trained eye to do so. Myers shows his ignorance of the fossil record and how transitional forms are actually classified, and it's rather embarrassing to look at. He's of the impression that everything that came up in the Cambrian explosion carried on forward outside the Cambrian, and we know they didn't, because many of those forms are extinct. The next error is one that I've only heard a few times. There aren't many people that throw this argument out there. The idea that gaps in the fossil record indicate an actual lack of ancestral forms. Now, that's simply not the case. So, why is this wrong? Well, fossilization is a very particular process, and it's very hard to find fossils of anything that doesn't have hard parts in it, like bones or shells. Soft bodies do fossilize, but the conditions have to be perfect in order for it to get done. Now, that's not to say we don't have any, but getting back to my point, expecting science to have produced a fossil of every single thing that's ever lived on this planet is simply unreasonable. It's just not going to happen. From what we can see of the fossil record and what we've discovered so far, based on what we've got now, we've only discovered in the fossil record and living today about 1% of all the species that have ever existed on this planet. There are 99% of species out there that we will never know anything about. And there are some species that we only know of from a single specimen, and there are still more that we only know about from a single fragment of that particular creature, because the whole thing didn't fossilize. It was a jaw or something along those lines, something that obviously doesn't belong to something we already know about, but we don't have a complete skeleton for the whole picture. So it's simply not reasonable to expect that we'll find a fossil of every single thing on this planet. It's just not going to happen. And any reasonable scientist knows that. Now, Myers, oddly enough, ignored a whole lot of peer-reviewed literature that directly refutes what he's saying here. All of his arguments have been effectively dismantled by every single peer-reviewed article about the particular period that he's talking about. In every section of his paper. Everything. Protein sequencing, formation of new genes, the Cambrian, everything that he talks about in this paper has been refuted even before he published it, or got it published. So he has no excuse. He obviously did not go and take a look at anything at all to see where the current research is. This entire paper effectively rolls every single misunderstanding of creationism that they have for science and paleontology and geology and genetics and half a dozen other fields of science into one thing. There's a reason that the journal in question pulled this article as soon as they figured out it wound up in there, because it doesn't belong there, because it is demonstrably wrong and does not stand up to scrutiny. If Sternberg were honest, he would have given it to the biologists that he had on staff and listed the names of the people that reviewed it. And even besides that, even if Myers wasn't a creationist, a geophysicist has absolutely no place speaking with any authority or formulating any hypothesis on a field of study that does not have anything to do with what he is trained in. We're talking about paleontology here, genetics, areas that neither him nor Sternberg have any idea what they're talking about on. I don't want to hear anything about paleontology from somebody who has not trained in that capacity. A geophysicist has not trained in that capacity. I don't care how good his credentials are. I don't care if he went to Harvard or Yale. If he's talking about paleontology with any authority, and he's only a geophysicist with no relevant training whatsoever in the field, he has no business giving his opinion at all. It's the same thing in a court of law. If you're not an expert in that field, you're not going to be allowed to give your expert opinion. Well, that's it for now, guys. Hopefully I can get through more than just one article next time. I'm going to try and get through these as quickly as possible because we got a lot of stuff to cover in this one thread. I'm also going to be pulling from a friend of mine that had sent me links that were associated with this thread before, because the original thread apparently got overrun and the individual who created that thread kind of lost all the stuff that he was trying to say. I don't know if he's going to put it back, but I've got the source material that he had, so I'm going to go with what I got. Also, on another note, I'm in discussions right now to do a video exchange debate with somebody. I'll let you know how that turns out. We're trying to figure out at this point who's going to go first, and I don't think he really understands how video exchange debates work. But if that happens, I'll let you know, and we'll start doing that. Other than that, I can be found in any of these places. If you like what I do, please consider becoming a patron. I'm not doing this for the money. I'm just trying to put out the best information I can, and every little bit helps me improve the quality of what I give you. So, as always, stay curious, guys.